unmiked, I'm hot. Yeah. I was whispering, we'll see how this goes. Okay. I know. Sure, it's a bit of a downgrade, but it has a pretty good message. All right. So thank you all, first off, for making it to the final presentation of the day. This day has been a fascinating discussion for me in particular, because this is a topic that I consider to be hugely important, as does, I think, everyone in the Zcash community. To be honest, I think this is just going to raise a lot more questions than provide answers, which seems to be a theme of today as well. So first off, this is obviously a tiny fib. Not going to be that revolutionary, and I apologize in advance for that. And let's just jump right in. A toast to governance, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. And I think particularly after the panel discussion today, because I did submit these slides a week ago, so I didn't anticipate this takeaway, but I've come to realize that governance is a lot like alcohol, in that you can have a little bit of it and feel great, but too much of it will kill you. So it's really hard. So let's try to reduce the problem space, because we're not trying to govern a nation or people. We're trying to govern nation-stateless digital cash without a monopoly on force. So that doesn't reduce the problem space. So a lot of the cases, and I think this was also brought up previously by other folks earlier today, is that this is a fundamental problem that we've faced for eons, and civilization has existed. And it's important for us to know what came before us and to try to understand it and apply it to our current situation. And America has this, for many, many faults, and for lots of other, despite the many warts in the American political system, I think it has a very good approach when it comes to, at least theoretically, balancing power and providing checks and balances. And that should inspire us all. The one thing that's problematic about, well, one of many things, is that the Federal Reserve is kind of like a cheat code. It enables you to bypass a lot of those things, and so that doesn't really work very well for us. And really, it's just that cash rules everything. Everything around cash defines so much of the way that system works. But cryptocurrencies, since they are in fact just cash when they come down to it, and I'm not the first one to envision it this way. There are many much smarter people that have talked about the various constituencies that exist in cryptocurrencies and cryptoeconomic systems. And you can start to categorize these groups as these sort of separate, separate constituents. You have developers, you have users, and you have miners and stakers. And to some degree, they all actually do provide checks and balances amongst each other. Like every group kind of relies, and even though we talk about trust minimization, they all trust the other two in some fashion. And every group also has kind of, in a natural effect, a power law of constituents around them. In the user's case, you have exchanges and whales, but then you have, on the long tail, individual users of a given cryptocurrency or Zcash. When a breach happens, each group has some form of recourse, and that might carry a cost. I think that still to this day, and I know many people in the room probably, they might debate me on this, but probably agree that the episode in Bitcoin's history with BIP 148 and the user-activated soft fork was one of the most remarkable kind of software cryptocurrency governance experiences that I have ever seen. And it kind of was, I think, a learning lesson. Lesson's a learning lesson. But it was kind of a lesson for all of us that are approaching these systems and trying to understand, like, where does power lie in these systems for people to make choices and to govern how a protocol evolves. So we can reduce the problem space in our case and just focus purely on the developer side, which is kind of nice, actually, that we don't have to consider those other groups, even though they are constituents. We can just talk about how we're going to govern development of Zcash. And that's where this concept of 2 of 2 multisig that Zuko had mentioned, I had talked about before kind of emerged as a way for us to define in a more, I think in a more methodical way, what kind of emerged organically in the Bitcoin side with BIP 148, which is how do we define, like how do we define the code and define the process by which the code that people decide to run in these projects? How does that work? So on an organizational level, you can consider this 202 multisig, that the Electric Coin Company, which Zuko gave us that update on and outlined their plans and their projects and what they're planning on doing. You know, they have a different incentive structure and they operate in a different way. That said, as far as a private for-profit entity is concerned, they are one of the most, if not the most transparent private for-profit entity I've ever seen personally. So I give them a huge amount of credit for that. On the foundation side, we operate as a nonprofit, and we have a duty of care and a mission that we're charged with that is sort of enforced by our board of directors. So I've used this slide a few times in a couple other talks, but this was sort of my attempt to consider the kinds of ways in which we overlap and the ways in which we have sort of separate responsibilities. And these things are constantly evolving and changing, but I think this is relatively up to date for where we are today. But when it comes to reaching consensus around developers and who's actually building a software, I want to focus on these very important things, which is the zip process, the company building and maintaining Zcash D, the foundation building and maintaining ZebraD, or Zebrad, if you mispronounce it like I do sometimes. And then the process that kind of gives us a blueprint for the things we could or couldn't implement in those respective node implementations. So this was really the like fundamental lesson from BIP 148 for me, which is that the new golden rule for all of us is whoever runs the nodes makes the rules. And that was like a really, really powerful insight for me. So when you go back to that like multisig chart, it's not so much that it's, you know, the company itself and the foundation itself that controls how the protocol's direction goes forward, but it's really the implementations of Zcash that define how the protocol evolves in the future. And so when you talk about sort of the zip process today, it's all very much ECC driven. And that has actually changed very recently, and it's going to continue to evolve. But tomorrow, there is this very, there's the laser. So there's this very amorphous kind of period where after going through the zip process, which has its own, I think, really well detailed step-by-step README for how one is supposed to go about adding things, there's this kind of ambiguous space where we need to figure out how we as the foundation decide to implement something into ZebraD and how the ECC decides to implement something into Zcash D. So there is this one way to keep the band together in kind of a hard power way, which is how we keep nodes together and nodes on consensus. And one way to do that is this sort of plausible threat of a chain split. The fact that if we have lots of ZebraD nodes running and lots of Zcash D nodes running, we are going to be heavily incentivized to make sure that they're consensus compatible and that we have mutual agreement about the protocol that we're running. But then, as Zuko mentioned, and it's something I'm also very excited about, there's this legal component that we have as an advantage compared to some other projects where we can actually craft an agreement on the legal side that defines what Zcash is. And that can help reinforce something that is provided by, in a more kind of like real politics sense in terms of who's actually running these nodes. And I think it's very important that this widely used alternative implementation exists because it gives users choice and voice and might compel someone who had a singular source of power to change their mind or compromise about something that they would have been doing otherwise. And that goes both ways. So this is, I think, the big question, and it's the big question for the ECC too. And it's a question that I'm not going to be able to answer in the duration of my presentation, but I hope that people join me afterwards at the Freeform workshop to talk about it. I can say there are a few things where it's obvious or relatively obvious what that process will look like, which for non-controversial, purely technical zips, we at the foundation are going to rely on the technical people that we hire and their expert opinion. And that portion will operate kind of like a technocracy, we hope. But for everything else, there's this, some of you have probably seen this, but this was a response after we started hearing community discussion about a dev fund. And where this response came from, to be explicit about it, was these guidelines came from an escalation to the board, because that was the kind of issue that merited that kind of discussion, board level discussion. And I think it's important to note that, internally that's how lots of nonprofits run in terms of very key decisions they have to make. But the board values and really wants community input. And last year, we had that governance advisory vote that was really cool and actually made, legitimately changed the direction of the foundation, because the board at the time used the results of that election to vote new board members in, even though it was purely advisory and they weren't compelled to do so. And similarly, I could imagine that some of these decisions that will be more controversial will continue to flow up to the board that way. But the other thing that I think it's important to cover, because Andrew mentioned it, if you remember, way back in day one of this conference, was the prospect of how you could do zip polls via coin vote today. And this is just another input mechanism that I view as an improvement to the advisory process, but it could also be something that we use in parallel to a resurgent governance advisory process, or something that could replace it. But the real issue here, which is what many people have mentioned earlier in their discussions today, is that if you do something purely based off of a coin vote, it is going to turn into a plutocracy. And anything that is binding by a coin vote would be terrible. And that's where we, I think on the foundation side, have the benefit of weighing that input with the board's perspective of how we need to achieve our mission to enable private financial transactions everywhere, primarily through Zcash, and weigh those things appropriately. But it's still valuable input, and I think it's something that we should consider alongside many other mechanisms for surveying community sentiment. And so I think it leads to this question about what comes after 2 of 2, which frankly I think, as Frederick alluded to earlier, it's going to be hard enough for us to even focus on having 2 well-supported consensus-compatible implementations. So we shouldn't necessarily jump the gun and start going to exotic multi-sig arrangements of governance quite yet. But the way that we get there is, I think, in the most real politic way possible, is for someone to commit to running another consensus-compatible node implementation. Because ultimately, those are the people that enforce all of the rules of the protocol. And that was something that I think that I'd love to see in the future, but not until we've actually established ourselves as having a widely supported kind of evenly distributed amount of nodes in Zcash D and Zebra D. So I purposely made that short because I kind of assumed that there would be a lot of questions. So does anyone have any questions? Oh. Yeah.
Check 2 1 2. Cool.
Yeah.
So I think you made allusion to, but sort of didn't explicitly reference. So I live a little more in the Ethereum world, and the Ethereum has the yellow paper. It's like a very sort of well-defined specification of what it means to be Ethereum. I think it's kind of interesting that you mentioned this trademark, which you guys want to share between the company and the foundation. But the United States government has the Constitution, right? And so like a formal written work that says like this is how we will govern ourselves, I think has internal value.
Sure.
So I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are around this, but you guys have two clients now, so it may make sense to say the canonical version of Zcash is this piece of paper that we've written that says this is what Zcash means.
So that's a fair point. And to be honest, there is actually what you could call a third implementation, which is the protocol spec within the Zips repo. And that protocol spec defines also what Zcash could be, but it's not canonical. Like sometimes there might be things in the code that are agreed upon in consensus, at least in the Zcash T case. And it's also not complete yet. So I think that is, it's actually in the Zcash case, I don't know that there will be a foundational document so much as there will be continued addition of possible implementations, one of which could be a completed protocol spec doc that then you can compare against with the other two implementations, if that makes sense.
Value in having people,
oh, sure.
You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Maybe bring that value.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good feedback, and that's possible. I think when if the protocol spec gets to be that mature.
No need to complete.
Goes out.
Yeah, so it was alluded earlier also so first of all, thanks for the talk, very clarifying. And someone alluded during Zuko's talk, the experiment that happened at ZCon 0, where there was kind of a community governance thing. So the first question is kind of what were your conclusions from that experiment in the sense of, is it something that is there something that the community or the Zcash Foundation could learn from it?
Yeah. So I think the main takeaways and why I wasn't, jumping up and down to do it exactly again is, and actually there might be people on the Zcash Foundation board that disagree with me, so I should just say that explicitly. But what I worried about it is that it was effectively myself and Andrew deciding who could be part of that panel. That's how the way it worked is that, and anyone was open to join it, and we basically accepted everyone but two people who were very obviously scammers. But everyone else had some, they either they were a pseudonym where we couldn't tell, or they had some, valid history with the Zcash community beforehand. And that's fine short term, but if that body then became, if they were asked again, for example, and I think it's reasonable to do it again, for this year perhaps, or another year, to bring them all back and say, hey, do you want to participate in this again? But I worry that if we keep going, it becomes like an old style House of Lords situation where by luck, because and the votes did work out like really well. I think it was instructive and we got a lot of information out of it. But if it becomes something where it's enshrined, 5 years, 10 years down the line, that's very dangerous. So I'd worry about that personally. But I know that there are people that have different opinions. So.
Yeah, so again, it's been an amazing journey. We couldn't have done it without you, but in the interest of fairness, the same question.
Sure.
What can we do better?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we could have done better. I think the biggest failing of the foundation, from my perspective, to just be a little bit self-critical, is that we moved a little too slow when we were first getting set up, particularly with establishing technical talent. And I think that's more a function of, as Zuko had alluded to, how high-end cryptographic engineering, the people that work in that space can definitely afford to buy groceries right now. They have lots of options, and it's a very tough market. That said, we still could have done better there. And then, there are a lot of times where we've talked about things where I think people have felt that we didn't have any power to actually back up the things that we've said. And most of what, a lot of the motivation for having this 2-of-2 multi-sig governance on the trademark side and having an independent implementation, in addition to the security benefits and having a separate code implementation, so that we can back that up when we say something. So, yeah.
There. It occurs to me that whatever decision-making process might happen, there may always be people who say it was illegitimate for some
Sure.
reason or another.
Sure.
So like, for example, with the community governance panel, in addition to voting for board members, they voted on a bunch of like policy positions. And then there's been discussion about, there's been discussion after seeing the results of the voting about whether being bound to those votes would be legitimate,
Right.
or not being bound would be legitimate, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you see any potential for us to find a decision-making process that we could sort of get enough people to commit to as legitimate in the short term before we discover what the results of the process are. Because I think that can potentially unwind a lot of conflation or confusion. I think it's natural when people see a result that they disagree with to find reasons to attack the legitimacy. I'm wondering if we can address that problem in any way, and if you have any ideas about that.
That's a difficult problem to address. I mean, part of it, I suppose, is yeah. So there's this tension, because I think the more formal and structured you make it, the more, and I think this was alluded to in the other panel, like the more that some people are going to be cut out or feel like it's illegitimate, and those voices might matter. You know, particularly to just being inclusive in that regard. Yeah, I don't have like a great, because a lot of it also comes down to the polls themselves, at least in the governance advisory experiment. You know, those were opened by individual community members, and some of them were underspecified and some of them were overspecified. And would it have been right for us to change the specification of what those polls were for the people that had submitted them? And maybe it would have been, but then it's almost like a meta question at that point. So yeah, all of which to say, I don't know, I think it's something we should maybe discuss in the future workshops, because I don't have a good answer.
You talked a lot about having multiple implementations, which I think is a great idea. I mean, it's very important.
Yeah.
ECC is a software company in some sense at its heart. It's got procedures and code reviews and coding standards and testing and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Same with Parity, who built the first ZebraD.
Yep.
But you're carrying it on from there. I wouldn't imagine the foundation is really a software company. So what is sort of how does it have a life that is sort of robust software creation as you release more versions?
And that's a good question, and a lot of it, I think, it comes down to us hiring people that have had that experience but want to work in a nonprofit context instead of working for a traditional like software startup. And we've made great inroads on that. We've hired some amazing people. More people are joining next month and the month after. And in that process, it's going to be kind of up to them and that team to start establishing the traditional software engineering process. And that's going to happen. Like, we know that we have to, you know, Mozilla is a nonprofit, and they still have, now they're a much bigger nonprofit, obviously. But
So just to confirm, your Zcash Foundation will be an entity that can produce software releases that
absolutely,
are okay.
absolutely,
Great.
100%.
Good.
To sort of follow up with the same line of thinking, multiple implementations tend to specialize in little ways in the ecosystem. Like, for example, in the Ethereum ecosystem, one of the node clients ended up specializing more towards infrastructure and things like that, whereas the other one ended up specializing more towards miners because it was faster and a lot easier to use in that context. And looking at the Ethereum 2.0 clients, there seems to be a lot of specialization, like one focused on mobile and light clients and just different areas. And perhaps like introducing, you know, ZebraD could be an opportunity to split the focus a little bit and have, you know, ECC focus on one part of the ecosystem, things they want to see happen in that direction. Maybe ZebraD, since, you know, you can compile with WebAssembly, maybe focuses more on mobile. You don't have to like attack in the same direction. You can explore in different directions as well. So just a thought.
No, that's great. I think that our current goal is just our like current big banner goal is we want ZebraD to be ready for Blossom activation. And then I think after that, like once we've gotten to that point, I think it's an open question as to like what degree of specialization we want to sort of shoot for. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do that for sure.
So thinking of the protocol spec as kind of a third implementation, what happens to the spec if there's disagreement between Foundation and ECC? Do we fork the spec?
Ooh. I don't know. I mean, if we do, so if there's disagreement that is unresolved, and the idea, behind the trademark agreement is that both the ECC and the Zcash Foundation have to agree on what constitutes Zcash, and if they don't, neither of them can use the Zcash branding. So it's a real kind of, it's a use it or lose it, I suppose. I'm not sure like what a good framing for that would be, but it's really like that we need to have that consensus. If we wind up forking at that point, it would be, we would probably both fork the protocol spec and then have it be defined as a different spec for each side of the fork. But I don't know that would, I don't know. That's a hypothetical.
I'm thinking both if there's an irreconcilable fork and also if it's a temporary fork.
Yeah.
So, say some temporary disagreement that could be resolved.
Later.
I guess you just use GitHub branches for that.
You guess what's that?
I guess you just use GitHub branches of the protocol spec.
Yeah, until or if it's a temporary issue that then gets resolved later on, yeah. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I've never thought about that, to be honest.
I'll have to think about it.
Me too.
The Zcash Foundation exists to support digital financial privacy.
Sure.
And Zcash is today the state of the art in privacy preserving decentralized internet money. Some of the people in this room or watching us are pursuing other approaches to financial privacy. Can you tell us about the Foundation's stance and activities in this regard?
Yeah, I think we're absolutely all for contributing to other projects that have the same goals that we do, particularly if it's on projects that are upstream that benefit both their project and our work on ZBRD or elsewhere. Ultimately, I agree that Zcash is the best tool for that right now, and we are primarily meant to serve Zcash. But if there's opportunity, say, to actually add privacy to Libra, that would be great. That anyone, Zuckerberg is watching this live stream right now, which I'm sure he is. I would love that kind of collaboration, or for other cryptocurrencies that are working on things where we are working on similar tools where we can enable that. 100%, absolutely.
Hey, so there are now 2 independent Zcash client implementations, which is super awesome. So we should celebrate that. Big step forward for governance. I think that the 2 of 2 is really exciting as well. Mm-hmm. My question is, if hypothetically there were to be a third body that were to come forward and through some process raise funding and develop a third client implementation, which let's say implemented the spec fully, passed tests, et cetera, and was viable, could the 2 of 2 be expanded to a 3 of 3 or a 2 of 3? And what would that process look like?
Yeah, I think it could. I definitely, and this is also a bias on the Foundation side, to move more slowly, I think, than the ECC. So in some sense, we might actually disagree on when is the right time to add that third party. But I really actually hope that does happen. Maybe not before NU5. I don't know. I have no idea. But definitely not within the next 2 or maybe 3 network upgrade cycles. But after that, I think it's very important for the health of the network and for the health of the protocol evolution for there to be multiple folks representing different stakeholders that way. Yeah.
Well, that's really important innovation, and I kind of wish we had this in Ethereum, so I'm a little jealous. That's awesome. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you. All right. Well, I think thank you everyone for those questions. I think time's up. And believe it or not, this is the end of ZCon 1, minus the free-form workshops, which there are in the what are they called? In the foyer, there's a listing. Thank you. Thank you. A listing of where we've randomly assigned rooms for all the freeform workshops. As I alluded to, I think Zuko's presentation and my presentation kind of teed up my freeform workshop about how the foundation and the ECC reach consensus on things, and I think that'll be an interesting discussion. So I obviously recommend that you come and see mine. Yeah. So the rooms, this is sort of like a soft exit, and then you can go to the freeform workshops, you can go to the beach, whatever you want to do, but the rooms here close at 5, and that is the absolute true end of ZCon 1. But before fully closing down, because obviously someone just handed me this random bag, and you're probably wondering why, we have lots of people to thank for this conference. Obviously, thanking all of you for attending and for participating and for being so active in the community and being here. We can't thank you enough. We can't thank the speakers and the workshop leaders and the volunteers enough for everything they've done. But there's one person in particular that I didn't get to thank in person last year because I wasn't here, that I think it's very important that we all probably already know, but it's important to understand that without them, none of this would have happened. So Anthony, if you could come up here very briefly, because so seriously, like without you, it's we're told from the open the bag, the